right, so we're going to start our first sermon here, and what I'm going to be doing is I want to try to describe the creation myth. The next couple sermons that I'm going to post are going to be solely on the creation myth. And one of my main points and objectives here, I guess, in the whole scheme of things, is to show that what we're really seeing is a movement from kind of like the Garden of Eden that we kind of had left from the fall of man, and that we are trying to return to that garden again, in which we call paradise. But the creation myth itself, returning to basically Genesis 1 or chapter 1, it's going to give us the very fundamental or the foundational ways of looking at Scripture. Pretty much, this is going to be in the background of so many of the stories that we're going to see. And what it's going to first show us is the cosmic understanding of both space and time. Okay, and understanding the space and time is going to allow us to see how other symbols in the Scripture are going to reference to this and how it unfolds, and how we can see how these things are really kind of ways of transformation. Okay, so this week, all right, we're going to start at the beginning, and we're going to start at Genesis, and we're going to look at the design of this process. And my hope is that we see particularities in the movements of things, certain patterns, let's say, that exist and unfold in reality, and it shows us the kind of what I like to call mystical cycles that become both true to human nature as they're true with the movements actually of our entire universe. Okay, and because these cycles and patterns scale from the heavens and back down to earth, we can consider them to be sacred. Okay, we call them sacred because they have a direct connection to God and a direct connection to the original design and the original order of existence itself. All right, which kind of is what makes up true reality, or what we would call reality. So we have now crested into the new year. Okay, we moved from 2024 to 2025. All right, and many of us during this time had celebrated one of the oldest celebrations that were known to all cultures. And this is, of course, the New Year's celebration. And though it is practiced in a variety of different ways, okay, and in different cultures, what we find is what underlies all the variations as a deeply embedded reality. What we will discover if we look at the act of the celebration and festival is that such moments break through the ordinary and mundane occurrences of life, and they kind of set themselves apart. And we kind of escape our everyday living, and we enter into this moment that seems primordial, okay? It's primordial in the sense that it always was, or in the least, it stands for the beginning of something, okay? And this moment, which above all other squares on our calendars, it demands its own square, its own space, and its own time. And this is simply because it remains a time that we carry out as what we would call sacred time. The sacred is what seemingly separates normal, or what Messiah Iliad refers to as a profane life, and from that which exceeds or is above or beyond the ordinary life. Okay? And therefore, we can consider things like the seasons or other natural occurrences as having religious or spiritual purpose. And that this is not to devalue ordinary life, but really to point towards the idea that amongst the ordinary, there is something that is extraordinary. And that such things are what bring with them deeper meanings, okay, or existential meanings. And what I want to point out, I believe this is probably the essential difference, really, to a spiritual life in comparison to a non-spiritual life. And that's to say that there is meaning to all things, right? That life is not arbitrary, and that we're not just these organisms that bounce off of each other, but rather that there is something deeper, right? And it is much more profound and meaningful to the rotation and the design of things. And that therefore a spiritual life is a life in pursuit of those deeper and hidden things that kind of unfold the existential meaning. So to understand the sacred is to understand the patterns that seem to make up what we often would call true reality, right? So to take notice of the patterns that seem to insinuate that there is some kind of an intelligent design that's behind these patterns. And then to be a spiritual person is to participate with those patterns consciously, believing that such patterns move for the sake of meaning and for the sake of purpose, and that we wish to draw ourselves closer to that purpose. Because within that purpose is actually a truth, a divine or existential truth, okay? And that truth in itself heals, and it is the truth that really kind of sets us free, all right? And that's because that truth has a way. It has a way of pulling us out of the dark, right, and into the light. It has a way of making confusion into something that's understandable and something that is able to be known. And it's truth that leads us to what we understand or what we call the good. So with that being said, let's move into Genesis and see how the first few parts of Scripture reveal to us God setting forth this mystical or sacred rotation of time as it refers to the first marker, the first day, and the first night. But to do this, I have to jump to the fourth day of creation, actually, and start on the 14th verse of chapter 1. So, then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, for the days and years, and let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on earth." And it was so. And then God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the fourth day. So if we start at the very top, right, with what all ancient religions considered to be sacred and known to be heavenly patterns, these are the rotations and the cycles of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Why have these always been understood as the most sacred of patterns? Because they're the most unchanging, the most true, and the most predictable patterns. They never fool you. They are as true as patterns come, because you can count on them to move the very same way every year, right? We can literally sit down and we can map out the moon and the star cycles for however long, all right? And we can figure out even when the next solar eclipse is going to come, and even the path that will show it, where it's going to show itself most prominently. And we can do this with perfect accuracy. So this gives us a clue onto what the nature of sacred is, right? Because the sacred is what is true to nature and true to that original creation. They were thought of as the most true and the most sacred because what we will find is that when we begin to move closer to the earth, the patterns of things actually begin to lose accuracy and trustworthiness, right? It's as if the distance from the heavens causes things to return closer to those chaotic waters that were before creation, right? So you will see the further the gap, the more things kind of take on an unpredictable nature. We'll see this more clearly when we speak about the serpent and how God forced him to crawl on his belly, right? But for now, let's move from the stars and into our atmosphere, and we're going to see the formation of the weather. So yes, the weather can be somewhat unpredictable. However, though the weather can be a bit difficult to nail down, we can still come close to figuring out the upcoming forecast. But in general, even though there are slightly abnormal temperature variations, which we would call unseasonable, we can still trust that there will be a spring, a summer, a fall, and a winter. We may have droughts, but we can count on rain coming at some time, and there may be the occasional floods, but for the most part, the waters will recede, right? So we can say geographically, and at what time margin of the year, that we're actually most susceptible for having things like tornadoes and hurricanes. And we can actually see which of those patterns are a bit less predictable than what we would say are the celestial patterns, right? We can say that because the weather patterns are a bit less predictable than the movements of the stars. But for the most part, the weather patterns are still within this kind of predictable or clockwork-like rotating pattern. So now we can move, if we move from the weather, if we move further down into the natural order of both plants and animals. Here the nature of plants and animals are also predictable to a large degree. But what I mean by this is that each creature and even a plant seems to bear its own temperament. The main two categories that we are well familiar with are, of course, prey animals and predator animals, right? And we can see how each of these have evolved to reveal and adapt to these temperaments that they have. So there's really nothing extraordinary about animals in the usual sense. They are somewhat predictable by nature, and again, I mean generally predictable, since we are aware that animals can act out of character, of course, and that's, makes up like probably at least 70% of the YouTube videos that we watch. But animals are predictable enough, at least in the first place, that these kinds of occurrences are why we make videos of them in the first place, right? So the other thing about plants and animals is that they can also be altered, they can be mixed, and they can be extinct, all right, which is something more than what the weather patterns were. So even though they're fairly predictable, they are, I would say, less predictable than the weather patterns. So the celestial patterns, most predictable; weather patterns, less predictable; plants, animals, even more or less predictable. And now this is where I'm gonna share with you guys an interesting thought. And for some it might be far-fetched, but I take no offense. But as far as consciousness, I feel, is concerned, in the sense of our ability to think and to filter the world through our personality and all the different ways that we act out, I have come to notice, if you were to break down all the archetypes and stereotypes and personality types that seem to make up all of the different people of the world, that each of these types seem to exist more concentrated in each individual plant or animal, right? So this is where I suppose that a lot of people, a lot of the spiritualist people get the idea of having like a soul animal or a soul plant, right? Or a soul flower. But, one of the things is, for instance, like what good are gnats, right? But that they're just simply annoying. And if you were like, let's say we were just like pick annoying out of the human consciousness, right? That's kind of like what it would look. It would look like a gnat, I guess, if you would think of it that way. And like if you would reach in and then you'd like kind of like pick out power or aggression, that would look like something like a bear or a lion or something like that. And if we picked out like sneaky and deceitful, that would be, of course, what we would consider as the snake. And also, as far as like plants are concerned, maybe you've heard of it already, where people have considered certain children as orchids, and then some other kids as being dandelions, right? So then that's all depending on like the sensitivity, like how much they're sensitive to the environment around them. So if you think about this, in my opinion, the rose is almost one of the most, I would consider one of the most conscious of the flowers. And what I mean by this is that they kind of through their layers, they reveal their beauty through these petals, right? But then they kind of show us this edgy personality at the same time, because beneath that they have all these like warding thorns, that are kind of poking out to protect themselves. So this is just something to think about for, those of us, if you're like me, that just sit there and spend your day wondering about consciousness. But anyway, all these examples of layers and patterns from the most stable cosmic layers, right, to the lesser stable patterns, like the weather and nature and all of that. The most unstable of these is, of course, us humans. And this appears to be the case because rather than such qualities being concentrated, right, as they appear in nature, all these qualities are accessible really to the human conscious, and pretty much at any given time. So as if rather than human creation being a part of consciousness or representing a particular or a concentrated aspect of consciousness, like the plant or the animal would do, we sort of embody all of it. So in other words, we have more diversity and a much larger expanse of characteristics within our conscious ability than any other aspect of nature. Essentially, we can see this in the psychology of archetypes. That's for all the Jungians out there. But there's a special reason for this. There's a special reason for the instability of human nature, one in which allows us kind of to see our place in that cosmic order. For one, we can use these patterns to help us understand what Genesis is talking about when it speaks about the fall of mankind. When the serpent spoke to Eve in Genesis 3:5 and said, "For God knows that when you eat of it, the forbidden fruit, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." The taking of the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden is essentially like becoming conscious, or having at least this full array of conscious possibilities. And this means to no longer be guided automatically as nature is guided. This is no longer to operate unconsciously or under such a concentrated framework as what we see in the majority of nature. But we're more susceptible to stepping outside of that order and to be able to see and to recognize that order and to emotionally feel that order, okay? And therefore, we are more tempted to manipulate or take on our own personal will. What then can we understand of our own consciousness? Well, we can understand that we have a somewhat self-governing ability, which does have its limits, but nonetheless, we still have the ability to act outside of or to act upon those established natural patterns, at least to some degree, okay? But what I mean, or what I would say is the most sacred, are the patterns which we can't so easily change. For instance, just like the patterns of the universe, which we read in Genesis, we also must split our day with the night, right? Just as the sun and the moon splits the day. We know this since this is a pattern that we cannot avoid. If we did not sleep, we would sink into that primordial madness and we would eventually die. So the same goes for the proper mix of solids and liquids. The earth is a mixture of both land and water. And ironically, we share in this pattern as well. We must have the combination of both solid foods and liquid hydration, otherwise we also die. The combination of these two natures are fundamental. And as we find later, it is also true for the human consciousness. Since at this point, I can assure you, these similarities with the universe and humanity are not coincidental. There are just far too many examples to dismiss the fact that we are so deeply connected with all of creation, right? And then there are also the ethical and the moral patterns as well. Ethical in the sense of how we all relate and revolve around each other. All the same like the planets revolve around each other to keep a balance and to avoid collision. So arguably, if we ventured too far from our morals and our ethics, right, this could also lead to some form of death, since we all must get along with each other for the greater extent, because we still very much rely on each other for our own survival. But how we arrange or how well we perform these patterns is generally up to us, and it's not necessarily automated. In other words, we consciously act these out, these patterns. Our own effort, responsibility, wisdom, and reasoning all play a part in the extent and the degree of how well these patterns are lived out in the world. So I do want to lay out a practical example that may help us understand what I'm getting at least in some sense, that we can see the idea of the sacred and how it moves from material reality and into our conscious reality. So the ordered patterns, or what would have been present in the original design, is what constituted the balanced state of creation found in the idea of the Garden of Eden. These are the conscious patterns, which again are what is considered sacred, right? And therefore we can visualize our modern world, like what we have now, as a puzzle, okay? Where the puzzle was once held together with all of its pieces in proper place. So if you could imagine, if humanity was at one point a whole and harmonious picture, as if there was one collective conscious. And this is easy enough to understand, at least from the evolutionary point, since at the very beginning of creation, of human creation at least, there would have been only a couple of us, right? And then we would have multiplied into a few of us. So you can see the collective conscious then breaking apart into other beings or other conscious beings. So now imagine that the consciousness that was singular and collective in that original state, right, would have split apart and would have fractioned this way and that, right? Now what we would have are all these pieces kind of rubbing up against each other like mismatched ridges or edges of a puzzle, right? And they're just trying to get into the right place. But then we can imagine if they all did come back together and they all fit together, right? This would essentially recreate that original image again. And as I said earlier, what we would call, this is what would have been Eden, or what we would moving into would have been called a paradise, which also means garden. So imagine we have the puzzle in front of us, okay, and it's scattered out. What would be the first pieces that we would go for to try to put it back together? The first pieces we would grab to put this puzzle back together, they would be the corner pieces, right? The corner pieces, or the pieces with the flat edges on the sides. And this is because they're the most obvious. They're the most clear pieces to determine where they're going to belong. These are going to be the pieces in which we could consider sacred. Why? Because they show us clearly the first hints of how that original design was laid out. They begin to reveal the origin or the intention of the puzzle's completed identity. They are the pieces we can determine as the least deceptive and the most obvious and the most true. They're kind of like the stars in the sky, right? Because you can figure exactly where they're going to be and where they belong, and with the least amount of effort. These are the pieces that are so evidently true, without question and without wonder. So with all that said, what can determine as sacred pattern? What can we determine as sacred patterns within reality? What can we consider as those corner pieces? Well, we started by speaking about New Year's, right? And the new year is kind of like a corner piece. It is a time that is chosen and marked off. It indicates an end and a new beginning. That we can understand that this day is kind of like a central pole, right? Which all the seasons rotate around. And it's by no accident that it is set around the time of winter solstice, which is actually also why Christmas is set around winter solstice, which was the end of December as well. Because the solstice marks off the longest stretch of night. It symbolizes the closest time, or the time that is most relevant to the dark and empty void. And this is kind of like when creation first formed. So as God shows us the steps and the processes throughout the 7-day cycle, he shows us this kind of progression, right? An evolution where reality must change and grow into itself. And God had created this not just one cycle, but rather as like a continuum of cycles, which comes back around and continuously repeats itself. As if these cycles now produce a gap, and that gap is like an expanse of time, what we can call sacred time. And I can only assume that this is sacred and meaningful because creation can now revolve around itself and attempt to repeat the beginning, right? It can attempt to shed off what had become to give itself another chance at becoming more than it once was. So we can then understand that the winter solstice appears as a time marked off, a time which is reflecting a kind of death, but for the sake of a new beginning. And we can further see how the gap between the beginning and the end is like elongated, or it's stretched out, because it unfolds its patterns of transformation throughout the year and throughout the seasons. This occurs as the days move from the solstice and from the barren winter and the world slowly comes back to life. And what we see is eventually the grass and the vegetation grow back into their full bloom. And at this point, the days are now reaching their longest hour as we crest into the summer solstice. And from this point, the pattern begins to reverse again. The days start getting shorter, and then we begin to work back towards the end once again. So can we see how this pattern is not only true for the seasons and the way in which pretty much our entire universe rotates, but it's also true of our own human nature. It is as if this very pattern of the universe, though held in a cosmic motion, right, is also infused within the human being. For example, as infants, we are still largely in the dark, as if we're starting at the very tip of that winter solstice. So babies, if you think about it, are really kind of half in and half out of consciousness, rising out of that dark solstice and then growing into children. They're springing into life, right? And after some time, we begin to near the summer solstice. I would say that that's kind of like our midlife. And at this point, we can consider ourselves in full bloom. But then, after that, we go over the hill, and we slowly start to digress. We start losing our color, we start losing our vitality, and we start to near further into the winter again, into our final solstice. So what's ironic is that many of us have just acted out this entire process when we had our New Year's celebration. So think about when you woke up from that dark unconscious and into the day. As you approach the night, for the most part, everyone was hopefully sober, right? As you're approaching the night. But then as the night nears to its end, everyone begins to lose control of themselves, right? Consciousness begins to slowly fade away, while it returns back into that primordial chaos that we saw in the beginning. And then when the ball finally drops, reaches its bottom, it's over. And everyone kisses each other goodbye, and we exit completely and go back into the unconscious. It is a celebration that has always been this way from the beginning, and yet many of us act these things out, and we have no idea where or why these celebrations and rituals were practiced in the first place. Even the biblical example of this is portrayed in the Day of Atonement, where the Israelites would have placed the sin of the previous year onto the scapegoat and send it off into the wilderness. So as now they could awake that following morning, right, as if it was Genesis all over again. And they could go forth with a clean slate, right? And yet this still echoes today. Because when we woke up the next day after our New Year's celebration, we had all these resolutions, right? So this is a true pattern. It's a pattern which we can be sure will occur. It's just gonna happen. It's gonna occur. And it appears to exist at all levels and at all realities. From the cosmic to the personal. From the macro to the micro. And what makes this sacred to the spiritual, the religious person, is simply to recognize that such patterns are infused in all creation, and therefore signify an intelligent design, and that such intelligence comes not by chance, but has something behind it. That consciousness is a living thing, though unseen and veiled, it is yet always there, and perhaps even more real than the objective world. And because of this, all things rotate and revolve, not arbitrarily, not random or without purpose. but that everything has a reason and a purpose, even death, or perhaps especially death. And that consciousness by which we experience individually is always in this cycle. It's trying to shed off what doesn't belong in order that we fit back into that completed puzzle again. The Christian conception of this reminds us of what Christ had said, that we are like the branch and that sprout forth from the true vine, right? And as we have spoken of our corner piece of the puzzle, we've also called Christ the cornerstone. And such is because by Christ's nature, we can see the perfect union of heaven and earth, the perfect reflection of God, within that conscious state of the incarnate Christ. And more so, at Christ's crucifixion, he shows us this very meeting place, the very center point of what the winter solstice, which marks off the end and the beginning. This is where his birth and death came together as one, since where there was the end of an old life, there's always the beginning of a new. Therefore, we participate in this pattern every morning when we resurrect from the tomb of our own unconscious. And we then remind ourselves that we are indeed a new creation. Don't forget to look around and take notice to these sacred patterns around you. Take notice that you share in the same motions as the entire universe. And know you are given time, and that your time is sacred. Every day is precious. Every moment is precious. And you hold within yourself the key to finding paradise, the conscious power to bring heaven to earth. Because as the patterns of the universe show us, you are divine and you are sacred. You are the very being which has been chosen to reflect the sacred patterns of God himself, and not by set rotation, but through the mystery and the mystic process of the developing consciousness. May we use our time wisely, and may we let what is sacred guide us, that we may not be lost in that primordial chaos, but that we find what is true and divine, that we may find love and unity with each other, and that we may find that love and unity with God. So may God bless you all, and I hope that you find harmony in your journey. Thank you.